Psychophysical harmony, Brian Cutter. And okay, first of all, Crummett or Crumet?
Crummett.
Right. I think it should be Crumet, and I'm going to have a word with him. So, let's just begin at the beginning. What is psychophysical harmony? It's kind of an abstract concept, and it would do well to explain it again.
So, psychophysical harmony consists in the fact that experiences are paired with physical states and with other experiences in suspiciously fortunate ways, striking ways, ways that seem to cry for explanation, ways that might seem lucky. So, let's start with an example. There's a certain brain state you have that leads you, that is typically caused by bodily injury and which leads you to engage in avoidance behavior, avoiding that particular stimulus and avoiding similar stimuli in the future. Conveniently, this brain state is kind of lawfully linked with a phenomenal experience of pain. Pain is intrinsically bad, plausibly. It gives us reason to avoid it. It gives us reason to eliminate it. So what we have in this situation is that pain is linked up with physical processes and behaviors in such a way that the experience gives us reason to engage in the very behaviors that we in fact engage in when we have that experience. So we call this psychophysical harmony, because here there's a harmonious relationship between the descriptive role of pain and the normative role of pain. The descriptive role is that when we have it, that tends to lead to things like avoidance behavior, elimination behavior, and so on. The normative role is the fact that it's bad. It gives us reason to engage in that very behavior. So there's a kind of harmonious alignment in this case between the descriptive or functional role of pain on the one hand and the normative role, what it gives us reason to do on the other hand. And in the paper, we go through a number of other examples of psychophysical harmony cases where there's different sorts of harmonious correspondences between the physical facts and the facts about consciousness.
Yeah, well, I want to ask you a few more questions about that one, but one that was a little more perspicuous to me was these instances of, I think you called them epistemic harmony.
Mm-hmm.
So you gave the example of like when you have a conscious experience of a yellow triangle, for example, you come to believe that there's a yellow triangle or something like that. What is this instance of harmony?
Yeah, so you have a conscious experience of a yellow triangle, and that's associated with the sorts of functioning and behavior that would go with the belief that there's a yellow triangle. So we're disposed to behave and function in ways that are appropriate given the presence of a yellow triangle. And so that kind of behavior and functioning harmonizes with our phenomenal experience as of the yellow triangle. With all these cases, it's maybe useful to think about hypothetical cases where the psychophysical correlations had been different.
Sure.
So suppose the laws of nature had mapped every physical state onto a slightly different chaotic TV static experience. So every microphysical configuration of your brain goes with a slightly different chaotic TV static experience. Then, we would still be behaving in all the same ways. We would be physically functioning in all the same ways, but there wouldn't be any kind of harmonious correspondence between our physical behavior and functioning on the one hand and our experiences on the other. So in the pain case, we would still be like avoiding stimuli that cause bodily harm and so forth. It's just that we wouldn't have experiences that rationalize or justify or make sense of that experience. We would still, when we're in the presence of a yellow triangle, we would still be behaving in ways that are appropriate to the presence of a yellow triangle, but our experiences would not in any way justify or rationalize or make sense of that pattern of functioning and behavior. Or think about our phenomenal reports. So, I suppose I see a black circle against a white backdrop, and I describe my experience. I say, I'm having an experience as of a smooth black circle against a uniform white gray backdrop. Okay, that's some speech behavior, and it corresponds with my experience in a semantic sense. My experience is such as to make that verbal report true. But if you consider the world where every physical state is mapped onto a chaotic TV static experience, or every physical state is mapped onto a slightly different, like neutral shade of gray experience, then we would still be reporting all the same things, saying all the same things, behaving in all the same ways, but our reports about our experience would be systematically untrue. So the key thought is the experiences are linked up with physical states in ways that achieve a kind of harmonious relationship between the reasons our experiences give us to act and our actual actions on the one hand, and a kind of semantic correspondence between the things we say and the actual truths about our experience.
So most people, many people, when they first hear this argument, are going to say, or are going to think that there's not really a mystery here. It's like, how else could these things be aligned? Like, the most common response to the argument from not just laymen, but also philosophers, is that evolution explains why we have this psychophysical harmony. That if you were some sort of bizarre organism that responded to painful stimuli by running towards it, then you would die off pretty quickly. And so you're not going to have much evolutionary success if you're this kind of inverted organism where pain and pleasure roles have swapped. So it's like there's just not that big a mystery. It's kind of like asking, why aren't we such that we uniformly jump off cliffs because we find it so enjoyable? Well, because we would have died off a long, long time ago if we'd done that. Now, I don't think that response succeeds, but that's the typical response. So why is that wrong?
Yeah, so a few things to say here. So I think those evolutionary explanations, they presuppose psychophysical harmony. They don't explain it. So
Okay.
in particular, in the case of pain and pleasure, if you assume that if you presuppose that pain is lawfully linked to avoidance behavior, that it's got this kind of forward-looking associated functional role where when you feel pain, you tend to engage in avoidance behavior, then it makes sense that evolution would see to it that we feel pain in response to harmful stimuli, because then we will tend to avoid harmful stimuli and we will tend to survive and reproduce and so forth. That's true, but that presupposes the fact of psychophysical harmony, that pain is lawfully linked to avoidance behavior. Pain is lawfully linked to the kind of behavior that it justifies or rationalizes or makes sense of. I think it's maybe easiest to see why evolution doesn't help explain the fact of psychophysical harmony if we start with a kind of epiphenomenalist dualism. So this is the kind of dualism defended by David Chalmers in his book, The Conscious Mind. So the thought is conscious experiences are distinct from any underlying physical state or process or property. So that they're like metaphysically distinct, but they are lawfully linked to certain physical states, like certain physical states in your brain. There are laws that say when you have this physical state, you have this kind of experience. When you have that kind of physical state, you have that kind of experience. But moreover, Chalmers wants to be kind of as naturalistic as possible. So he accepts physical causal closure. Everything that happens in the physical world has a complete causal explanation in terms of prior physical causes. So experience exists as a distinct feature of reality, but it kind of doesn't make a causal difference to what happens in the physical world. So we're still going to accept causal closure. Well, if you accept that kind of view, then imagine the psychophysical laws had been different. Instead of the laws pairing, this particular brain state with pain, they paired that particular brain state with pleasure, or with a neutral gray sensation, or with the TV static experience. Then the pattern of experiences would have been different, but the physical world would proceed just as it does in the actual world, because the causal forces driving the physical world, including the causal forces driving evolution, are going to be exactly the same. So evolution will proceed exactly as it does. It's just it's going to lead to a situation where, when I touch fire, that leads to an experience of pleasure, which then leads to the kind of avoidance behavior that allows me to survive and reproduce. Or under different psychophysical laws, when I touch fire, that leads to a neutral gray sensation, which then, sure enough, leads to the avoidance behavior, and so on. And so what evolution explains is why harmful stimuli are associated with avoidance behavior and so forth. It doesn't explain why the laws of nature link that disposition, that functional profile of avoidance behavior to the very kinds of conscious experiences that rationalize or justify or make sense of that avoidance behavior.
Okay, that actually is very clear to me, at least in the case of epiphenomenalism. But a nuance that I want to discuss is whether or not holding to an identity theory changes this. But before we get into that, I think we still need to frame a few different aspects in terms of the discussion. So your argument here is an argument for thinking that psychophysical harmony is evidence for theism over naturalism. First of all, is that correct? That's kind of the basic thesis.
Yes.
Okay, so what do we mean by naturalism and theism in this context?
Yeah. Naturalism, let's understand as the view that the natural world is all there is. And moreover, the natural world is kind of at a fundamental level purposeless. It's not fundamentally ordered teleologically towards the realization of value. So you don't have the kind of picture that Thomas Nagel defends, where there are like fundamental teleological laws of nature whereby the universe like strives for the realization of certain kinds of valuable outcomes. That's going to count as non-naturalistic on our definition. But basically, the natural universe is all there is, it's not teleologically ordered towards the good or towards anything whatsoever. That's naturalism.
Okay.
Theism, we define pretty standardly that the universe was created by a being that is perfect or unlimited with respect to knowledge, goodness, power. So as we note in the paper, we think psychophysical harmony, it's primarily evidence against naturalism. For the sake of simplicity, we treat theism as the alternative to naturalism that we're most focused on. But as we note, psychophysical harmony might provide equally strong evidence for various alternatives to theism that are non-naturalistic. So maybe limited designer views, maybe like impersonal axiarchic views, wherein you say that the universe exists and has the features that it does because it is good for it to exist and have those features. And you don't follow up with a writer like, and that's why God brought it into being. You just let that value fact be the bedrock explanation for why the universe exists. That would count as a non-naturalistic view. But as far as I can see, like that view is going to predict psychophysical harmony more or less just as well as theism. Other views, like maybe Nagel's kind of teleological view of nature, arguably views like that could predict psychophysical harmony as well as theism. So we don't claim that psychophysical harmony favors theism against those kind of theism adjacent views, but we do claim that it favors theism relative to naturalism.
Right. I think that's a good way to characterize it, that this is primarily an argument against naturalism for whatever theistic or quasi-theistic alternative we have in mind.
Yeah.
So why think then that psychophysical harmony... So as I understand it, the very basic logic of the argument is that psychophysical harmony has a low likelihood given naturalism. It has a decently high likelihood given theism, and therefore the fact that there is psychophysical harmony is decent evidence for theism over naturalism. So that first step then, ascribing a low probability or likelihood of psychophysical harmony given naturalism, that we just wouldn't expect this fact of harmony given naturalism. Why think that? What's the idea?
So I think this part of the argument runs most smoothly if we're working against the backdrop of something like dualism, property dualism about consciousness. We argue in the paper that we can relax that assumption, but for the sake of initially making this
Mhm.
point, let's work with the dualist assumption. So dualism here just being the thought that conscious experiences are distinct from any broadly physical property or state. So there's distinct from neurophysiological properties or functional properties or dispositions to behave. They're kind of fundamental extra properties over and above the physical. But of course, the dualist realizes there are these like robust law-like correlations between physical states of your brain and conscious experiences, and so the dualist is going to want to go in for what they call psychophysical laws, which are just like extra laws of nature in addition to the physical laws that link physical states of matter to conscious experiences. Okay, so that's just background. Let's work with that picture. Again, that's the kind of picture defended by David Chalmers, and it's a picture that many philosophers who aren't antecedently inclined towards theism are going to be sympathetic to. Um,
Okay.
okay, so with that in the background, why think that psychophysical harmony is very unlikely given naturalism? The basic thought here is that most conceivable psychophysical laws would not result in the degree of harmony that we find in the actual world. And moreover, that's true for the simplest psychophysical laws, including psychophysical laws that are much simpler than the actual psychophysical laws seem to be. I add that second part, or I emphasize that second part, because you might think that there's a kind of a priori bias towards simple laws, and so even if most laws don't have some feature, if the simplest laws had that feature, then you wouldn't say that it's
Right.
particularly unlikely if you think that there's some kind of a priori bias towards expecting the laws to be simple. Okay, so the thought is, okay, so let's first kind of bring out the intuition that kind of most ways of mapping physical states onto conscious experiences would not result in harmony. And there's not really a rigorous way to show this because I don't have like I can't like mathematically describe the space of possible laws and throw a natural measure over it. But I mean, you can just kind of think of all sorts of possible ways of mapping physical states onto experiences. So, there's a mapping that, maps every physical state onto a neutral shade of gray. There's a mapping that maps every physical state onto a slightly different TV static experience that kind of mirrors the chaotic microphysical structure of the system. There are mappings that only map microphysical entities like elementary particles onto experience and don't give experience at the macroscopic level the way we have. You can just conceive of like all sorts of coherent ways in which the laws might have mapped physical states of matter onto conscious experiences. And it looks like in the vast majority of these, we don't have the kinds of harmonious alignment between the experiences and the physical states that we have in the actual world. So in most of these, we don't end up behaving in ways that our experiences give us reason to behave. Probably in most of these, we end up behaving in ways that have like no normative connection at all to the experiences we have. So if the laws had given every physical state a different neutral shade of gray, then we would still be behaving in all the same ways, but none of our behavior would be kind of rationally or normatively justified by any of the experiences we have. Okay, so that's kind of the first part. And now let's just think about the second part where I claim that even the simplest psychophysical laws don't have this harmonious feature, or at least many conceivable sets of psychophysical laws that are much simpler than the actual psychophysical laws don't seem to result in the degree of harmony that we find in the actual world. So, again, I think it's easy to cook up lots and lots of psychophysical laws that are much simpler. So take one that like just maps every elementary particle onto a different ringing sensation with the phenomenal pitch proportional to the mass of the particle. Okay, that's a very simple, elegant psychophysical law. Doesn't give you any of the kinds of harmony that we find in the actual world. Laws that map every physical thing onto the same neutral gray sensation. Again, very simple psychophysical law, but doesn't result in the kind of harmony that we find in the actual world. So to summarize, the fundamental reason for thinking that harmony is very, very, very unlikely, conditional on naturalism, is that it seems like the vast majority of ways in which the experiential could have been lawfully linked to the physical are ways in which we don't achieve the degree of harmony we find in the actual world. And that's true for even the simplest mappings, which intuitively would be the most a priori likely conditional on naturalism.
So I'm inclined to agree with you that even though we can't give a rigorous statement of the probabilities because we can't chart the conceptual space of possible psychophysical laws in that kind of way that would be required to make a very precise probability assignment, I still have like some philosophers' objections that I think don't ultimately succeed, but they do trouble me. The first would be that, I mean, to my mind, like the range of possible psychophysical laws is infinite. And so, how do we get a grip on that infinite space of just possible ways of combining the physical and the psychological so that we can say the range of harmonious correlations is small compared to the range of total possible ways that these two things could have come together? I mean, do you agree with that first part that the range of possible psychophysical laws or correlations is probably just infinite?
That seems very plausible.
So then you get troubling implications if you take the comparison range of possible laws to be infinite. I mean, for one thing, how do we know that somewhere else in the infinite range of possible ways aren't other harmonious interactions? I mean, there might be ways to reply to that objection in the same way you might reply to the same objection in the fine-tuning argument case, but I'm not sure. I mean, does it trouble you at all about this, that psychophysical laws can take an infinite number of forms, and who's to say how many of those are harmonious and how many are not, even though in the range that we're thinking about here, it seems like only a select few are harmonious?
So this kind of objection doesn't trouble me. It strikes me as a merely technical issue for
Yeah.
regimenting the argument within a Bayesian framework
Yeah.
that doesn't undercut at all the intuitive force of the argument. So maybe a way of pushing this point is to note that you can basically run a version of this concern for any abductive argument for more or less anything. But I maybe it'll be clearest to think about like other hypothetical abductive arguments that you might run for theism that intuitively seem really, really good given certain sets of data, but where these technical challenges would arise. So you see you do some physics, you find out that in the interior of the atom, there's the prologue to the Gospel of John spelled out in New Testament Greek. Intuitively, this is just massively strong evidence for theism. And if you wanted to be kind of rigorous and write a philosophy paper about it, you might couch it in a Bayesian framework, and you might say, look, the probability of the Gospel of John being in the interior of the atom conditional on theism is higher than the probability of this conditional on atheism. And then someone could raise the same technical challenge. Like, there's infinitely many things we might have found in the interior of the atom. This space of possibilities is kind of unruly. We can't put a natural measure on it. So how can you say that finding the prologue of the Gospel of John in the interior of the atom is more likely? We can't assign probabilities here at all. I think this is purely 100% a technical challenge for dealing with probabilities in infinite probability spaces, but it doesn't at all undercut the force of the argument. And I guess I'm inclined to say the same thing with the similar technical challenges to both fine-tuning and to psychophysical harmony. There are tricky issues that arise in the infinite case, but we shouldn't confuse kind of technical challenges for a certain kind of mathematical apparatus for thinking about abductive reasoning with problems for just the, the, the abductive reasoning itself.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think you're right. So another perhaps more serious issue is that I think implicitly when you're contending that harmony has a low likelihood given naturalism, you're applying a principle of indifference to the space of possible laws and correlations, such that which with the idea would be that any specific psychophysical law is just as unlikely as any other. And so if you have a huge space of possibilities, well, then the likelihood of any specific one is going to be extremely small. But obviously, the principle of indifference has come under hard times of late. And we also appeal to it in the case of fine tuning. And so something I want to think more about is how we can defend a principle of indifference. But I know that in certain simple cases, or at least in some cases, applying a principle of indifference can lead to contradictory results depending on what you take to be like the way that you carve up the space of possibilities into similar cases and then apply the principle and say, okay, all of these cases are equally likely. So first of all, do you appeal to a principle of indifference in this argument? And secondly, do you think that's problematic, or do you think the principle is perfectly fine?
I don't think we appeal to anything quite so strong as like a spelled out version of the principle indifference from which you could derive the usual problematic results. So I agree that it's, the principle of indifference, it initially strikes you as pretty plausible, but then you can look at these like cube factory cases and see that it gets you contradictory results. And one response is to say there's something true in the vicinity, and we just need to qualify it to avoid these problematic results. That's what I'd be inclined to say, by the way. Another is to just chuck it entirely. So while I am inclined to think that there's got to be some truth in the vicinity of the principle of indifference that I don't quite know how to spell out precisely, I don't think we need to rely on anything quite so strong. I mean, it's true that we rely on something that looks a bit like indifference reasoning, but a couple points. So first, we do think that there's going to be we allow that there will be a strong bias towards simple laws. So it's not merely that we enumerate all the conceivable laws and then go for a uniform distribution over all of them. So we allow for biases towards simplicity, which is maybe against the spirit of the indifference principle. And secondly, I guess this returns to my essentially the same point I made in response to the infinity worry. It seems to me that there are many cases of just clearly good reasoning that have to appeal to something that looks kind of like indifference in the way that our reasoning looks kind of like indifference, but where the reasoning is just clearly unproblematic, and where it would be just very confused to try to say that the reasoning was bad because it appeals to something like indifference. So again, you see, you go into your yard and you see the leaves spelled out to form a message like hello Miles, and you reason in a Bayesian way that it was very unlikely that the leaves would spell out a message given that no one was there to visit you, and comparatively more likely that they would spell out a message if someone did come to visit. So you think very likely in the posterior someone intentionally arranged these leaves to spell out a message. And I, looking over your shoulder, point out, oh, did you just appeal to a principle of indifference? It looked like you did, because you were saying, like implicitly you were thinking like the vast majority of ways in which leaves could be arranged would not spell out a message. It's just a very small measure of the possible arrangements of leaves that correspond to a message. That looks like illicit indifference style reasoning. You can't reason that way. Okay, so clearly I'm the one who's confused in this case. I mean, it's true that your reasoning is relying on something in the vicinity of indifference reasoning, but it's also just completely, entirely legitimate. Like, this is the correct way to reason in this case.
Yes. Again, I ultimately agree with you. But playing devil's advocate, or just the skeptical philosopher, which I like to do, The two cases are, I think, relevantly disanalogous. And I think what a skeptic of the principle of indifference would say is in a case like seeing the leaves arranged in a certain way to spell out a message, like we have a wealth of background information about botany and trees and leaves and gravity and how often
Mhm.
messages like this appear, which would provide some kind of like evidential basis for ascribing an equal probability distribution to all the possible arrangements of leaves. So to give a very simplified example, like why is it that we think that each side of a six-sided die has an equal chance of coming up, right? There are six sides, and so the probability of rolling a six is 1/6. And so you might say, well, we're appealing to a principle of indifference there. Well, we are, but we also know that the die in this case is fair. We can roll it a million times and we would get an average distribution of basically 1/6 of the time it comes up on each particular number. So we have like frequency data to ground the equal probability distribution. Whereas in this kind of grand metaphysical case of the universe as a whole, or of fine tuning, or of psychophysical harmony, we're kind of just we're applying the principle of indifference, but with like no empirical data or frequency data to ground it. And so it might be that in those cases that you mentioned, or the dice case, is perfectly fine to appeal to that kind of principle, whereas in these more metaphysical and speculative cases, it's not.
Yeah, a lot of people say this kind of thing, as I'm sure you know, in response
Sure.
to fine tuning arguments that, yeah, we're just in no position to assign the likelihoods of, fine tuned constants conditional on naturalism
Yeah.
because we don't have frequency data, we've only observed one universe, and so on. And I think this is just bonkers. I mean, the general principle that you need frequency data in order, otherwise you're just completely 100% in the dark about probabilities because, okay, so, I use the case of leaves and people arranging them. And yes, we have lots of frequency data and experience with leaf arrangements, and we know how commonly they tend to go into message-like arrangements without special intervention. But just take the initial arrangement of matter at the beginning of the universe, and suppose that we do the calculations when we find that the atoms at the beginning of the universe spelled out the prologue of the Gospel of John. Like, again, obviously, this is great evidence for theism, but the principle in the background here that you just can't assign probabilities at all where you don't have frequency data would predict that even discovering that the initial configuration of matter at the Big Bang spelled out the Gospel of John in perfect biblical Greek, that would be no evidence whatsoever for theism. That's just that's just a reductio of the principle. So anyway, I think,
Hmm.
yeah, I just think it's really implausible to think that we can have no basis for assigning even rough probabilities in the case of like one-off events where we don't have frequency data.
Yeah. Yeah. Amen, brother. I agree. I would like to, though, have a more concrete understanding of and justification for something like a principle of indifference. I mean, that's a future area of study for me because you get a lot of grief when you engage in any kind of indifference reasoning in lots of different contexts in philosophy. Whereas to me, I find it bewildering that someone would be committed, and happily so, to just a blanket denial of the principle. For me, it's like an undeniable principle of reasoning that we utilize all the time. And it's kind of like denying the validity of induction, I think. It may be not as bad, but like, I guess in theory you can, but like, not really.
Yeah, I think there's going to be a difficult philosophical questions about how to make it precise, how to qualify it. But yeah, I think that there's got to be some truth in the vicinity.
Yeah. Well, I agree. Okay, so that's half of the argument that psychophysical harmony. Okay, actually, I'm gonna plug in my Ethernet cable, and I think that'll help. So give me just one
Great.
sec. Don't think that made any difference at all. Well, maybe. No. Okay, it's fine. It really is fine. It's just I wish I'm used to being able to figure things out But I think the internet and Wi-Fi and connection and streaming is just so far out of my wheelhouse
Getting more
that I can't.
complicated every year.
I swear, I'm not an engineer, people, so I need someone to just step in and help me. So if you're in the comments, I mean, if you're watching the video, comment on this, email me and help me. Help me figure out how to get better streaming quality. Okay, so the half of our case was the likelihood of harmony given naturalism. It's low. The naturalism is true. It's very unlikely we would have this fortuitous harmony that is evidenced in our psychophysical laws. The other half of that case is thinking that psychophysical harmony is not that unlikely if theism is true. Why think that?
The basic idea is that God, by definition, is a perfectly good being, therefore, a being who we would expect to act for the sake of the good, to create a world that realizes various valuable states of affairs. And there are, many valuable states of affairs that require or essentially involve psychophysical harmony. So take, rational action, behaving in ways that reflect your reasoning, reflect your experiences, reflect your reflect your thinking, where your conscious states provide reasons for the actions that you then go on to do. So like rational agency, meaningful agency, kind of veridically modeling the world in perception is going to require a degree of psychophysical harmony. So if the laws had mapped every physical state onto like a different ringing sensation, then there would be not any sense in which our experiences of the world like model or reflect or represent the external world. They wouldn't form a basis for knowledge or rational belief about our environment. They wouldn't form a basis for any kind of meaningful interpersonal relationship with others. So, I mean, if you just kind of think through all these alternative psychophysical regimes, like the TV static regime, the neutral gray regime, and you think about what sorts of lives would exist in those, they're just very clearly lacking many or all of the kinds of value that we find in our world. Values of
Yes.
enjoyment and interpersonal relationships and rational agency and knowledge and virtuous exercise of our faculties and so on. So I think just kind of the key point is there are a lot of goods that essentially involve psychophysical harmony that would be impossible without it. And that's why it's not wildly surprising that a being who acts for the sake of the good would create a world that exhibits psychophysical harmony. I should say, by the way, I think, we focus on psychophysical harmony, but we also know that the very existence of consciousness itself
Yes.
is itself, I think, some evidence for theism. I mean, it's, given at least given our dualist assumptions, a universe is only going to feature consciousness if it adds consciousness to its list of fundamental properties and adds extra fundamental laws that make provision for the occurrence of consciousness. And that's a little bit surprising on naturalism. I mean, it makes the world more complex. So to that extent, it's less likely on naturalism. And there's no particular reason on naturalism why the universe would feature consciousness, whereas it's very unsurprising on theism, especially given the assumption that consciousness is required for many or perhaps all forms of value. So, all the goods like enjoyment and rational agency and knowledge and virtuous activity and interpersonal conscious relationships all require consciousness. So it seems like consciousness is, a world without consciousness would be devoid of many forms of value that we actually find, perhaps all forms of value in the actual world. So it seems much less surprising that there would be consciousness at all in theism than on naturalism. But then when you add to that the further facts about the specific harmonious way in which they match up, I think that boosts the evidence.
Yeah, I mean, the argument structure here is identical to what you would say in the case of cosmic fine-tuning, that a universe that's fine-tuned for life allows for great goods that an otherwise barren or simple universe lacking complex structure would not allow for. and God is perfectly good, so it's
Yes.
not terribly unlikely he would bring those things about. But I'll raise a concern that others have raised in the fine tuning case as well, that this response assumes value realism. It assumes that there are facts about value in the first place. Because if there aren't, well, then really there's no way to argue that a law featuring psychophysical harmony is any different than any other random arbitrary pairing. They're all alike in their value features, and therefore there's no reason to think that that psychophysical harmony has a different likelihood than any other specific non-harmonious law. So, do you think your argument presupposes value realism, and is that problematic? Because, there are plenty of philosophers and people who aren't value realists.
I don't think it presupposes value realism. At most, it presupposes that the priors aren't certain that, or aren't very confident that value
Mm.
realism is false. So suppose your priors are open-minded about these philosophical questions about value realism. Let's just say for simplicity, you're 50-50 on value realism. And then you think, given value realism and theism, then you would expect a world with, it's pretty likely that you'd get a psychophysically harmonious world. Okay, but value realism itself was only 50% likely, so the likelihood is going to be cut in half. That's fine. I mean, uh, the argument just requires that the likelihood of psychophysical harmony on theism is higher by a
Mm.
significant factor than the likelihood of harmony on atheism. We think the likelihood of harmony on atheism is very, very low. So if we're talking about like reducing the other likelihood by a factor of 2 or 10 or 100, I think that's just not going to make a big difference to the likelihood ratio. I think that's the main thing. It's just, yeah. But I also think it, well, two more points. One, I think value realism is just very plausible. It's very plausible that excruciating pain is bad, and that fact doesn't depend on like what anyone thinks, and so on. So I don't think that would be a big cost. But also, I think theism just arguably entails value realism. So if we're just asking what's the likelihood of harmony on theism, and theism already bakes in value realism, then it's not going to be a further commitment. You don't need any further assumptions at all. I mean, that might lower the prior probability of theism, but I mean, the reason why theism, at least arguably, entails value realism is that God is going to be
Right. Right.
definitionally
Right. Right.
perfectly good, so that's going to require that there are facts about perfect goodness. And so I don't think doubts about uh, value realism would affect the likelihoods of harmony on theism, though it might adversely affect the prior for
Yeah,
theism.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I mean, in the fine tuning case, I think makes this even clearer that the likelihoods we're talking about of like fine tuning given naturalism is something like 1 part in 10 to the 136th. That's what Luke
Yeah,
Barnes,
yeah,
the cosmologist Luke Barnes, estimates it to be. That's an extremely small likelihood. So even if you thought that the prior odds of value realism were 1 in a billion, and then you thought that
yeah.
the prior probability of God's existence was 1 in a billion, and you multiply those two to get the probability of their conjunction, assuming one doesn't entail the other, well, then you're still going to get a total likelihood that's way higher than 1 part in 10 to the 136th power. And so, actually, upon encountering fine tuning, you should conclude not just that you have strong evidence for God's existence, you also have strong evidence for value realism in the end. And I think that the same can be said here. It's just less obvious because we haven't attached specific numbers to the different viewpoints.
Yeah, and I think this highlights an important point that is kind of mathematically obvious, but is often missed in discussions of Bayesian style arguments in philosophy of religion, where it's often assumed that the Bayesian argument for God is going to say that you've got some datum and it's very unlikely on atheism, whereas it's pretty likely on theism. Uh, and then people raise worries like, well, how can we know the psychology of God, what kinds of worlds God would create, so how can we say this is very likely on theism? And the key point, which is kind of what you've highlighted, is you absolutely do not need to say that any of this is very
Right.
likely on theism, or even even moderately likely, even 0.5. It could be 1 in a million. It could, depending on how low the likelihood is on the other side, and with fine tuning, you're going to need like exponents to express those likelihoods. Then you don't need any like immodest degree of confidence about
Right.
what God would do. You just need a highly modest claim that this is not a crazy way for God to create the world. Yeah.
Case for saying that uh, condition obtains here. So I want to quote Graham Oppy and get your response once again to this evolutionary objection, because I think, especially for like the non-specialist, this is going to be the primary response. And so I think it bears repeating why it doesn't work. So here's a short excerpt from Graham Oppy. Things are much worse than Cutter and Crummett suppose. In the envisioned scenario, the creatures will rush into the willing embrace of predators and flee from the presence of conspecifics. If, per impossible, there were species of creatures set up in this way, they would immediately head for the extinction outdoor. It is straightforwardly impossible for there to be creatures with a long evolutionary history that are set up in the way that the envisioned scenario requires, where pain and pleasure are inverted in this way. More strongly, it is impossible that, in creatures that are the product of a long evolutionary history and that have sufficiently sophisticated neural functioning, there is psychophysical disharmony. Once again, let's just discuss why that's mistaken.
Yeah. So again, first consider the case of epiphenomenalism, where these experiences are superadded over and above your physical states, but they don't have any top-down influence on your physical functioning, your brain processes, your behavior. In that case, if we consider scenarios where we change the psychophysical laws and you map the actual physical basis of pain onto pleasure, let's say, then all the physical stuff will proceed as before. We will still avoid fire, avoid predators due to the forces of natural selection. It's just that, when we stick our hand in the fire, we will feel pleasure and then go on to avoid it just as we
Right.
actually do. So that, I think, is pretty straightforward. A little bit more complicated when we consider the interactionist forms of dualism, where we allow that conscious experience has some top-down influence on your behavior and functioning. But here, I think it's pretty clear that any evolutionary explanation here is going to presuppose a degree of psychophysical harmony. So if we suppose that there's harmony already in place in the forward-looking causal role of pain, so we assume that the laws give to pain a forward-looking causal role such that pain causes avoidance behavior, then evolution will see to it that we feel pain in response to fire and bites from predators and so on. But that already presupposes harmony, that the laws give to pain a forward-looking causal role that is the exact role that pain rationalizes or justifies. If we consider other possible psychophysical laws, maybe ones that give pain the actual forward-looking causal role of pleasure, such that pain leads to like repeating the experience and pursuing and so forth, then evolution will not give us pain in response to fire. Evolution will give us, pleasure or whatever else plays the relevant role in response to fire. Maybe a nice way of thinking about the puzzle within the context of interactionism is, if interactionism is true, then the psychophysical laws do two things. First, they give pain characteristic causes, and they give pain characteristic effects. So in the actual world, you got a certain brain state that leads to pain, which then top down leads to certain physical effects, including avoidance behavior. But now imagine an alternative set of psychophysical laws that slots literally any other experience into that same nomological role. So let's take pleasure. It gives, the actual physical causes of pain instead produce pleasure, which in turn causes the actual effects of pain. Okay, in that world, then evolution will select for creatures that feel pleasure in response to touching fire, and where pleasure systematically leads to avoidance behavior and so on. Or slot the neutral gray sensation into that nomological role. In that world, when we get bodily injured, we have a neutral gray sensation, which then leads us to exhibit avoidance behavior. Again, a milder, it's like a milder form of disharmony, but still a lack of harmony that we find in the actual world. Our behavior has no rational connection whatsoever to our experiences, what our experience gives us reason to do. So, I mean, the key point on interactionism, which is a slightly more subtle point, is look at the actual nomological role of our experiences with their actual causes and effects, and then consider alternative psychophysical laws that slot any other experience into that same role, and you can see how that leads to harmony. So then there's this question, why is it that the actual psychophysical laws slot exactly the experiences in that would lead to the harmonious result?
That seems clear to me. The objection that I think is the most powerful and the view that's most difficult to square with the harmony argument is some kind of identity theory between the mind and brain. That at some level, mental states just are brain states. Now, if that's the case, then it seems that we can't say that the psychophysical laws that happen to obtain are contingent. Rather, if there's an identity between a certain brain state and a certain mental state, like C firings in my brain are a certain configuration of them are identical to the feeling of pain, then it doesn't make sense to ask why the psychophysical laws weren't different than they are, because it's impossible for something that's identical to itself to be any other way. If pain just is identical to that that sequence of neural activity that causes avoidance behavior, then it wouldn't have been possible to have any other alignment. They're just identical. And if evolution can select for avoidance behavior in particular brain states, well, then it can select for mental states because they're just the same thing. Now, I think you contend that your argument will still work even if it doesn't have to presuppose that the identity theory is false, in other words. But things get a lot more complicated. The argument becomes much more subtle. So I just want you to speak to that. I mean, does your argument, on its face, it seems to propose that, or presuppose that psychophysical laws are contingent, that they could have been different. Whereas if you say that they're metaphysically necessary, perhaps because of this identity, then there's no mystery. It's like wondering, why does 2 + 2 = 4? Well, it couldn't have been any other way.
Yeah, so you're right that it does somewhat complicate the argument. Ultimately, I think once we think clearly about the kind of the likelihoods here, it actually doesn't affect things in any significant way at all. So let's first distinguish two forms of, well, there's different forms of physicalism that I want to talk about, but let's first distinguish a priori and a posteriori physicalism. So a priori physicalism, which Chalmers calls type A physicalism, says that it's a priori. I mean, this is basically the view of David Lewis and David Armstrong, who say that it's a conceptual truth, an a priori conceptual truth, that pain is whatever state plays the pain role, where the pain role is like a complex functional role involving, typically being caused by injury and typically causing avoidance behavior and so on. If that's just what the concept of pain is, just the state that plays the pain role, then I agree the argument fails. There's no mystery. It's in fact it's certain that given that there are states that play the pain role, then there's that pain is what occupies that role, just because the concept of pain just is, on this view, the state that typically leads to avoidance behavior. So on this view, no mystery as to why it is that when we feel pain, we typically engage in avoidance behavior. Okay, so just want to concede that on a priori physicalism, type A physicalism, the argument doesn't work. Type A physicalism is the version of physicalism that says there's not even an epistemic gap between the physical and the phenomenal. So, for example, zombies aren't even conceivable You can't, like, it's just a priori incoherent to suppose that there could be something physically just like me without consciousness. And similarly, the type A physicalist will say that Mary in her black and white room, when she goes out and sees red for the first time, learns nothing new, gains no new information about the world. Does not gain any new knowledge. That okay? So that's type A physicalism or a priori physicalism. I think that view is just. We both think that view is implausible. There's at least an epistemic gap between the physical and the phenomenal. It's conceivable that there be something physically exactly like me, functionally, behaviorally exactly like me, that has no conscious experience whatsoever. So if you agree with that, if you agree that there's at least an epistemic gap between the physical and the phenomenal, but you want to be open to physicalism, then the kind of physicalism you want is what's called type B physicalism or a posteriori physicalism, which would say, like, conscious states are identical to or perhaps grounded in physical states. So there's a necessary connection there. It's metaphysically necessary, but it's not epistemically necessary. There's not, it's kind of epistemically opaque connection. Okay. So our claim is, let's set aside a priori physicalism. We think that's implausible. The most plausible form of physicalism is this a posteriori kind. A posteriori physicalism just doesn't really affect the argument at all. So I think this is easiest to see if you go in for the kind of what Jonathan Schaffer calls ground physicalism. This is the view that conscious states are distinct from any broadly physical state, but fully grounded in physical states. And moreover, there aren't causal laws connecting the physical to the phenomenal, but there are a different kind of law, metaphysical laws or grounding laws connecting the physical to the phenomenal. So these grounding laws, according to Schaffer, are metaphysically necessary, but they're epistemically opaque. So we don't figure them out a priori. It's just a purely a posteriori matter which physical states ground which phenomenal states. Okay. Now, if this is the kind of physicalism that we're entertaining in the background, I think it's really easy to see that this doesn't really change the epistemic situation at all. So when we're thinking about the dualist framework, then there are all these epistemically possible scenarios with different laws of nature connecting the physical to the phenomenal. And, since only a small subset of them are harmonious, that's what leads us to think that the likelihood of harmony on atheism is low. When we bring in the ground physicalist framework, we have basically the same distribution of scenarios, except we call the laws grounding laws instead of causal laws. But there's still going to be roughly all the same epistemic possibilities of which physical states might conceivably ground which phenomenal states. And for the same reason, the vast majority of those are disharmonious. So the likelihood of harmony given atheism and ground physicalism looks like it's going to be similarly very, very low. Here, it's important that we're talking about epistemic probabilities. Those would be the kinds of probabilities relevant to like a Bayesian epistemological argument. Even though only one of these is going to be metaphysically possible, they're still all going to be epistemically possible. And so we're going to have to distribute epistemic probabilities across them. So that's the case of ground physicalism. I think it's just very straightforward that that's not going to affect the argument for the low likelihood of harmony on atheism. And now essentially the same point holds if we want to bring in identity physicalism. So identity physicalism says that every phenomenal property is identical to some broadly physical property, maybe a neurophysiological property or a functional property or a behavioral property, something like that. Again, so identities are metaphysically necessary, but we're assuming there's an epistemic gap. So whatever the true identities are not going to be epistemically necessary. There are going to be a wide range of epistemically possible hypotheses a priori for what the psychophysical identities will be. So maybe the psychophysical, maybe pain is identical to this physical property, or maybe it's identical to that physical property, and so on. The vast majority of hypotheses about what the psychophysical identities are going to generate disharmony. So for the same reason, we'll get a low epistemic likelihood of harmony conditional on identity theory and atheism. I think it's maybe helpful potentially to compare this to an analogous response in the case of fine tuning. So, in the case of fine tuning, what people sometimes say is, okay, we've got these constants and they fall within this very narrow life permitting range. That seems very striking. But what if the constant values are metaphysically
Hmm.
necessary? Then they couldn't have been different, in which case, we have no basis for saying that given naturalism, it was very likely that they were outside the range. I think this response just fundamentally confuses metaphysical and epistemic possibility. And what matters for the argument is just the epistemic possibility. So a way of seeing this is that the hypothesis that the constant values, whatever they are necessary, does not predict that they would fall within the narrow life permitting range. Epistemically, the hypothesis that the constant values, whatever they are metaphysically necessary, does you know is compatible with the necessary constant values being here or here or here. Most of those are going to be outside the life permitting range. And so the hypothesis that the constant values are necessary actually doesn't predict that they would be life permitting any better than the hypothesis that they're contingent. Similarly, if you want to say that the psychophysical correlations are necessary, maybe because they're underwritten by grounding laws or identities or whatever, that doesn't predict that they would be harmonious any better than the hypothesis that they're contingent. I think that's just fundamentally a confusion of metaphysical and epistemic possibilities. So the point is like if the kind of physicalism we're interested in is the kind that concedes that there is an epistemic gap between the physical and the phenomenal, then the space of epistemic possibilities for the psychophysical correlations is going to be structurally more or less the same as the space of psychophysical correlations for the dualist. It's just that at the end of the day, you're going to claim a different kind of metaphysical status or underpinning for those correlations.
I wonder though if there's a relevant difference in the case of fine tuning. Like, we have no reason to think that the constants are metaphysically necessary, and so
Mm-hmm.
the we have no reason to think that the constants are metaphysically necessary. And it seems to me that that fact is what allows for like the epistemic probabilities to go through in a case like. But what if we discovered a very strong argument for thinking that the constants were in fact metaphysically necessary? So now we had good evidence, good arguments for concluding that. Would that fact undermine the fine-tuning argument? Because I incline to think that it would. If we found out that the constants couldn't have been any other way, there would no longer be a fine-tuning argument. The points you mentioned about the difference between epistemic and metaphysical possibility aside, like I don't know how to cash that out, but it does seem to me that if we found out that the constants could not have differed in the strongest sense of the word, there's no longer a mystery as to why the values are life permitting.
So I think that might undermine the cognitive, or that might undermine the fine tuning argument. But if it does, the reason is that you can no longer justify the high likelihood of fine tuning on theism, because the argument for theism making it reasonably likely that the constants would be fine tuned, arguably that depends on a degree
Mm.
of contingency such that God has control over it and would exercise that control in a way so as to realize value. Um, and if we then find out that the constants, whatever they are necessary, that discovery would show that God could not exercise control over it, and that would undermine the reasonably high likelihood of fine tuning given theism. I think what you would get in that situation is that on both, just the general hypothesis that the constants, whatever they are necessary, that would have the result that on both theism and atheism, it's extremely epistemically unlikely that they would fall within the narrow life permitting
Mm.
range. And then when we find that they do, it would be like, okay, this is just a mystery, and even God can't explain it. Similarly, you might say that if we knew for sure that, let's say, physicalism was true about consciousness, or if we were antecedently certain of that, then that might undermine the psychophysical harmony argument in a
Mm.
parallel way. Uh, but not by undermining the claim that harmony was very unlikely on atheism, but rather by undermining the claim that it was comparatively more likely on theism. Uh, However, I think it is unreasonable to be certain or nearly certain of physicalism a priori. You should maybe you should be open to it. I mean, I honestly think like psychophysical identities strike me as a priori incoherent, but that's a they strike me as analogous to the claim that like being red is being square. They just like clearly those are distinct things, however well correlated they are. So I think if anything, the a priori considerations favor the distinctness of the phenomenal and the physical. But in any case, I think as long as you're not close to certain of psychophysical identities or a necessary relation between the physical and the phenomenal a priori, then I think you can. I think the argument will go through. You'll have the low likelihood of harmony on atheism, and as long as there's a significant chunk of your probability distribution that allows for contingency and therefore for divine control, then you'll get a reasonably high comparative likelihood for theism of harmony, and then the argument should work. That's kind of how
I mean, I've thought about this before in the context of fine tuning and psychophysical laws, and it just still troubles me that if we did get a really strong argument for thinking that our psychophysical laws are metaphysically necessary, then what you're saying is, even given that, the proper epistemic situation to envision for drawing out the evidential significance of psychophysical laws is one wherein we forget that we've already found out these laws are metaphysically necessary. So you're saying, no, we have to consider the general hypothesis that whatever psychophysical laws happen to obtain, well, those ones are metaphysically necessary, rather than the more specific information we have that these specific ones are metaphysically necessary. I find that to be an obscure point, that we have to abstract away from things we know and then compare a general hypothesis against theism. And it's like, okay, well, yeah, if we delete that element of information, we will not get any different likelihoods just supposing they're metaphysically necessary, because we've deleted our knowledge of what the actual correlations are. Now, I understand why we do that, because we want to know what the evidential significance is of finding these specific correlations. So of course we have to delete them. But it just seems to be that something has gone wrong if we find out that they couldn't have been any other way. And so to me, what I would want to say in that situation is that every single hypothesis just attributes a likelihood of 1 to our psychophysical laws because they're metaphysically necessary. And that might be wrong, but that's what I would want to say.
So let's distinguish general identity theory, which says that every phenomenal property is identical to some physical property, with a specific identity theory, which says, which asserts the general thing, but then says, oh, by the way, here are the identities. Pain is C fiber firing, and so on. The specific, so my claim is the general identity theory doesn't predict harmony. You're right that the specific identity theory does predict harmony, makes it likelihood of 1. But my thought is it has a correspondingly lower prior, just due to its sheer specificity. And an exactly parallel point goes for dualism. So suppose now we're working within the dualist regime, we can consider general dualism, which is the claim that phenomenal properties are distinct from but lawfully linked to physical properties, where that's neutral as to how they're linked, like what the psychophysical laws are. And then we can look at specific dualism, which asserts general dualism and says, oh, by the way, here are the psychophysical laws. C fiber firing goes to pain, and so forth. So the situation is exactly parallel here. Specific dualism, even given atheism, makes harmony likelihood 1 because it just builds in the psychophysical correlations. But my claim is, well, I mean, it's but specific dualism, I mean, that's true, but specific dualism had a correspondingly low prior. So atheism and specific dualism, yes, it gets a big boost from the harmony data, but since it had a very, very low prior, it doesn't end up with a very high posterior. General dualism and atheism, maybe that had a decently high prior, but that makes the harmony data very, very unlikely. So that's going to get evidentially disconfirmed. I think it's just parallel in the physicalism. So general identity theory might have a decently high prior, but it doesn't predict the harmony data, nearly as well as theism. Specific identity theory does predict the data, but has a correspondingly low prior. Okay. It looks to me like whether we're dealing with identity theory or dualism doesn't affect the structure of the probability.
So I'm recalling a passage from your original paper where you say that sometimes phenomena can give us good reason to conclude that not only, say, is theism supported over naturalism, but that these correlations are in fact contingent. And so if you have a hypothesis, the general hypothesis of theism says that these very specific correlations are non-negligibly likely. You compare that to the general identity theory, grounding theory, physicalism of whatever the correlations happen to be, they are metaphysically necessary. Well, that doesn't predict our specific correlations. So then when we discover the specific correlations of harmony, that gives us reason to affirm theism plus a contingency to these psychophysical laws.
Yeah. And I would say the same thing about fine tuning, by the way. Suppose you're open to whether the constants, whatever they are necessary or contingent, and then you find out that they have these like very, very striking values that can be nicely explained on the hypothesis that they're contingent and divinely ordained. That's a big boost to that conjunction. And so after observing the fine-tuning facts, we should be more confident in that conjunction and also more confident in each of the conjuncts in this particular case. The example we give in the paper that's supposed to illustrate the general lesson here is, I think we call this Boulder Island. So you're on a voyage to an island, and I think it's going to have boulders on it, and you're pretty confident, but not extremely confident that no one has been to the island before. And you're also pretty confident, but not extremely confident that boulders are humanly immovable, because boulders are really, really big and it'd be hard for humans to move them. But then when you get there, you find that the boulders are arranged in this really cool pattern, like Stonehenge, or maybe it spells out a message or something like that. Intuitively, this is really strong evidence for, intuitively after observing this, you should be pretty confident in the conjunction that humans have been here before and they're movable. Movability is kind of slotting in for contingency here. And, just because the datum that they're in this really cool pattern is much more likely on that conjunction than on its falsity. So that, afterwards, even though you started out thinking probably boulders aren't humanly movable, you should be confident that they are humanly movable. And in fact, were moved by the humans that you previously didn't have an opinion about whether they were there.
Okay. I think
it's a somewhat complicated example, but basically humans being there is analogous to there being a God. Movability is analogous to their contingency and thus
changeable
divine control.
Okay. I think that's right. These things get subtle. I mean, I think that most cases where you have to begin introducing the distinction between metaphysically possible and epistemically possible can be difficult to articulate. There is a relevant point there, but it gets confusing because the points get abstract. You naturally want to think that if certain situations are metaphysically impossible, what does it even mean to say, well, they're still epistemically possible? But I think that there is a distinction to make there.
Yeah, and I agree that it's subtle and complicated. I think the less ambitious and more straightforward form of the argument just kind of is conditional on dualism. If you're convinced because of the explanatory gap, hard problem of consciousness, so on, that consciousness is distinct from the physical and merely lawfully linked by these contingent laws of nature, Then on that assumption, I think the psychophysical harmony argument goes through really straightforwardly, cleanly.
Yeah.
It's strong evidence. Once you want to be open to these other mind-body metaphysics, maybe identity theory, maybe other forms of physicalism, the issues get more subtle, and you need to make these tricky distinctions between epistemic and metaphysical possibility. I think the argument still goes through, but I totally concede the point that that's less obvious because the issues get much trickier.
So I wanted to ask you about the gap problem that someone might charge the psychophysical harmony argument faces. In the case of fine tuning, the gap problem is that even if we've concluded that a cosmic designer of some sort exists, there's a gap between that conclusion and theism, the claim that an all-powerful, all-knowing, perfectly good designer exists. Like, the designer for all the fine-tuning argument could tell you might only be capable of designing universes, and then he or she or it faded out of existence immediately thereafter. So how do we bridge the gap in the fine-tuning case between a designer of the universe and that designer is God? So then in the psychophysical case, this view, the argument might give us reason for rejecting naturalism and preferring some sort of theistic hypothesis of some kind of arranger of the psychophysical parameters of our universe, an agent of some kind or other. Does it give us any particularly strong reason for being like robust theists, you might say, for believing in the omni-God? There you go. What do you think?
Yeah, first point, definitely concede there is a gap here. And I think it would not be unreasonable to react to the psychophysical harmony argument by concluding, okay, this pushes naturalism out of the running, but now my view is just going to be kind of a disjunction of theism and quasi-theistic views. So I'm just going to be agnostic about traditional theism versus axiarchism versus limited designer versus this and that. Further work needs to be done to say why among those theism should be preferred. So here I think there are a few things to say. One is a kind of familiar Swinburne style argument that the prior probability of theism is going to be higher than the prior probability of various limited designer hypotheses. And here the move is just in general, positing something with an arbitrary finite degree of a quantity is going to be more complex or more arbitrary and have a lower prior probability than positing something that's without arbitrary limits. So positing that the speed of light is infinite, that's going to be higher on the priors than positing that it has some very specific finite speed that's compatible with our measurements, say. And so similarly, the traditional theistic hypothesis that God is unlimited with respect to attributes like knowledge and power and so forth, that's just going to be higher on the priors than limited deity hypotheses. That I think is correct. I'm not sure how much that buys you. I mean, first we want to distinguish between, it's one thing to claim that theism has a higher prior than any particular limited deity hypothesis. It's another thing to say that theism has a higher prior than the disjunction of all the limited deity hypotheses, or all of them that do a decently good job predicting the data of psychophysical harmony or whatever else. Where that latter claim is less obvious. I mean, I think it's pretty clear in the case of the speed of light. So it's true, so Swinburne makes the point that before we had, there was a time before we could measure the speed of light where we knew that it was at least pretty fast, and we thought it was probably infinite. In that evidential situation, it just seems way more plausible to think that it's infinite than that it has any particular highly precise real value speed that's compatible with our measurements. But I think even in that evidential situation, we shouldn't have thought it was almost certainly infinite. We should have thought decent chance that it's infinite, decent chance that it has some finite value within this range. Neither would be totally surprising. I think agnosticism would be reasonable in that situation, even though we should be fairly certain of rejecting any particular finite value. So the analogous thing here would be like, maybe we should think that theism is like a respectable
Sure.
hypothesis, but we should be agnostic between it and various limited designer hypotheses that do pretty well predicting fine-tuning and psychophysical harmony and all the rest. I think there's a counter move to be made here, which brings in other arguments. So suppose you think that the metaphysical foundation is metaphysically necessary. So here, wheel out some off-the-shelf cosmological argument that says that the universe has its source in some like metaphysically necessary being, and maybe you do some argument that like whatever the designer is that's responsible for psychophysical harmony is also going to be this necessary foundation. Now I think it looks a lot more attractive to go in for the traditional God than limited deities, and this is because of the connection between necessity and non-arbitrariness. So it's one thing to say that like the speed of light has some or other arbitrary finite value, but that should be contingent, right? Like where there is arbitrariness, there should be contingent. There could have been light or light star that had a slightly different speed. But where you have necessity, it seems like necessity is repugnant to arbitrariness. So once you're convinced, maybe on the basis of other cosmological arguments, that the foundation, that the like foundation of reality is this necessary concrete being, I think that that gives more boost to the idea that it would be without arbitrary limits. So that's going to be additional considerations favoring traditional theism over limited designer hypotheses. There's still some work to do about like, okay, what about like impersonal axiarchism, where you just say like the mere fact that such and such would be good is the bedrock explanation for why the world is this way. You don't need like a God who uses that as their reason to make the world that way. My feeling about these views is that those kinds of impersonal axiarchic explanations are just manifestly incomplete. Like if you say the reason why the universe is life, that has constants that are life permitting or whatever, is that it's good for there to be life. And you don't follow that up with, and that's why God chose to bring it about or whatever. You just say, no, that's the bedrock explanation. I just feel like that it is not a complete explanation. That value factor is not explained. So I think impersonal axiarchism, that's my main beef with it. There's other views like the Nagel style teleological views. Off the cuff, I don't really have too much to say about why you should prefer theism.
What is Nagel's view?
I guess one for so his thought is that like in addition to the known laws of physics, the universe is governed by like laws of teleology, by which the universe kind of strives to realize various valuable states of affairs like consciousness and rationality and knowledge and life and so forth. So I'm counting this as non-naturalistic, but it's the kind of view that it doesn't have God, and it's the kind of view that can arguably predict things like psychophysical harmony. I mean, you'd need to work out the details. I'm not quite sure how you do that, but arguably it can. I guess the last thing I'll say about why to prefer theism, I think there is going to be a role here for just historical data tied to particular religious traditions. So, I'm a Christian, and I think a lot of these arguments from natural theology are pretty good. But if I looked at history and I didn't find any like remotely compelling theistic religious traditions, but I found these philosophical arguments, I think my attitude would be that something in the ballpark of theism is probably correct, but I'm not sure if it's theism or one of these adjacent views or something else. I think I would be inclined to say like naturalism, that's not the way to go. Something theism adjacent looks more probable, but I would have a fair helping of agnosticism about theism versus various alternatives. Whereas, I think when I look at history, I do find like a particular religious tradition that has a degree of credibility on the basis of various historical things that I won't go into. And if we add that to our total data, then I think like the particular teachings about the nature of God within that tradition are going to be a posteriori, like more likely. But I think like my degree of certainty of those particular claims about the nature of God are much higher in virtue of finding this particular religious tradition credible. But even finding this particular religious tradition credible is kind of colored by, views in that vicinity having a decently high prior on the basis of the purely philosophical considerations. So that's kind of how I think about it.
I think people undersell the role of historical context in informing what we take to be live options and what we don't. I mean, the question will just then be whether or not that's a strictly rational procedure. Like, does it really make a difference that we've been exposed to a certain view over time as a reason for ascribing a higher prior? I think there's probably a way to spell it out so that it's not so seemingly irrational to be that way. Because we could imagine having a particular history, cultural, historical progression where we had all sorts of obviously false ideas about ultimate reality, or even not obviously false, but just obviously different. It's not clear to me that that would automatically mean that the rational thing to do would be to ascribe a higher prior to those bizarre sorts of hypotheses, just because as a matter of historical contingent accident, we had these views. Or is there a different way to spell out the historical context point?
I wasn't thinking that the historical contexts, I wasn't thinking that it was the mere fact of historical familiarity of these views that gave them a boost. I was thinking more just there are particular historical facts that make Christianity in particular seem pretty plausible to me. And I guess like here's a simple-minded rational reconstruction. So on the basis of the purely philosophical considerations, maybe you get a pretty high probability of something theist-ish. Okay. Now you look at, let's say, historical arguments for like the resurrection of Christ, say. And against the background of a high probability of something theist-ish, together with the various suggestive pieces of evidence, those all taken together make you highly confident that like Christ is the real deal, rose from the dead, and so forth. Okay, so now you're like a Christian, and the particular claims of Christianity about the nature of God are going to carry some weight. And what does Christianity say about the nature of God? Well, it says something that coheres with the view you already held on this rational reconstruction, but sharpens it up, tightens it up, is more precise, is more certain, and so you believe that. That would be the kind of simplistic rational reconstruction of how you can combine kind of like pure philosophical natural theology with historical arguments for something like Christianity to end up a posteriori with theism being much more likely than the various adjacent alternatives.
Okay, fair enough. That makes sense to me. Well, Brian, thank you for coming on the channel today and talking about this interesting argument, which is quite parallel to my own area of study, the fine-tuning argument. I think people will find this interesting, and hopefully it furthers the conversation on this interesting argument.
Yeah, thanks for having me.